Okay, so last week we talked about generosity and giving, and we're going to continue that theme today. Last week I said that based on the teachings of Jesus, especially the greatest commandment and his interpretation of the greatest commandment using the Good Samaritan and his life and example and even his death, that generosity must be a core principle or value of the Christian life. That if we are to love God and love each other, we do that primarily, or at least a big portion of what that means is that we are generous to one another. Generosity is a foundational expression of the Christian life. I said last week that generosity is not just about giving money. It's about giving our time, our talent, our grace and forgiveness, and any number of other ways that we can give of ourselves. But money is important. Money is part of the generosity equation. If you think about how much of our lives we trade for money, not just the hours, and if you work 40 hours a week, you are giving about over a third of your waking hours in exchange for money, but also our entire education, all the years that we put into our education, all the resources, all the effort, all the sacrifices that we make in not being with people we love because we have to be at work, all of that is traded for money. So money represents this portion of who we are. And if we're going to be generous, then we have to include that portion of who we are in the equation. And last week, I also said that generosity is not just about giving to the church. That when we talk about a Christian's generosity, we are including other organizations that they give to. And we're also including relational giving. So giving that goes not to your immediate family, but just when you hand money to anybody, whether you know them very well or don't know them very well. That's a kind of generosity as well. Today, we're going to talk about tithing, what it is, and what Jesus says about it. And because Jesus is complicated and nuanced on this subject, we're also going to talk about an alternative way to think about giving money. And I want to talk about how the church is different than any other organization we give to. So first of all, tithing. If you grew up in a conservative church, you may have heard at some point, tithing is a biblical mandate. The Bible commands us to tithe. That is not correct. That is, I don't know. Dishonest? I don't know what it is. I would say that tithing is a biblical assumption, that if you read the Bible, there's lots of references to tithing, lots of assuming that it's a certain way that we give is by tithing. But it never says the right amount to give is a tithe. And if you give a tithe, then you're good. In fact, Jesus only mentions tithing twice. Once in what we just read, and once in the passage we read last week, and both times he's critical of the tither. Last week it was the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee, they were both praying to God, and the Pharisee said, God, thank you that I'm not like all of these other terrible people in the world, because I'm a good person, I follow the law, and I tithe. And the tax collector stood far off and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus said, the tax collector who is penitent is the one who is justified in the eyes of God at this point. So it's not just because you can check a box that you said you did all the right things, that something has to happen on the inside and in the heart. And we got a similar message today when Jesus is saying, it didn't come in this translation, but in the NRSV, it's woe to you Pharisees. Woe to you Pharisees. And in the NRSV, it's for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, so very light things, but you neglect the weightier matters of justice and righteousness. It is these you should have practiced without neglecting the other. And we also heard in that reading today that as he sat down, he said, well, you've got to give alms from within. And if you start by giving alms from within, everything's going to work out. So very clearly, tithing or giving 10% is not a box that we can check and we are good and we are right. But let's dig into tithing a little bit more. And so that's why we have the apples. Have you counted the apples? There are 10 apples on the table. You probably know where I'm going with this. The apples represent all of our income or our wealth, or however you want to think of that. And to tithe then is to take one apple and give it away. Keep nine apples and give one away. But what most of us do, or a lot of us do, I think, is we get ready to give this apple away and we're like, oh, but there's some other things I want. I want to go on a vacation this summer, and it's kind of a nice vacation, so I'm going to keep half for myself, and I'm going to give away, like half an apple. Oh, and I got the kids I got to pay for college tuition for the kids, so I'm going to keep a little bit more, give away this much, and that was a really nice dinner we had last night. That's a little bit more. And we get to there's an old saying that you may have heard that we tend, instead of giving away what's right, we give away what's left. And that's what this is. That's what we do. Now, that's one way to think about tithing, is to think about it like, what can I afford to give away? The other way to think about it is, why, when so many of us live fairly comfortably, when many of us have a comfortable income, when we live in the richest country in the world, or one of the richest countries, where there's lots of services provided for us, why can we not afford to live on 90% of our income? Why is it that we live our lives in such a way that we make the margins of what we can afford smaller and smaller and smaller? Why can't we live more simply, more frugally, in such a way that we have wide margins and we have a certain amount that we can always have available to give away? But whatever we do, however we think about this, one of the things that tithing shows us is that when it comes to giving of our money, we can always do the math. We can always look at how much we're going to give and how much we have, and we can come up with a percentage. You can't objectively calculate very many of the virtues that we are called to practice. You can't know whether you are giving generously when it comes to the kind of love that you give to a stranger, or the patience that you show to your spouse. It's hard to calculate that. But you can calculate how much you give away with a calculator, and you can get an exact objective number. So what the idea of tithing invites us to do is to think about it, to think about the giving of our money holistically. And the Bible assumes tithing, but Jesus does not. Jesus is much more complicated when it comes to giving. We talked about the two stories already, where Jesus is criticizing tithers because they think they've checked a box. A couple other examples of Jesus and giving. The story of Zaccheaus. Zaccheaus is the wee little man who climbed the sycamore tree to see Jesus, and Jesus was passing by, and Jesus says, "Zaccheaus, come down." And Zaccheaus came down, and Jesus said, "I'm going to have dinner at your house tonight." And something moved inside Zaccheaus, and he said, "Jesus." People were looking at Zaccheaus and being like, why is Jesus asking him? He's a tax collector. He's a guy that we don't, who's not trusted by our community because he cheats us and gives the money to the Romans. Why is Jesus inviting him? But something was moved inside of Jesus, and inside of Zaccheaus, and Zaccheaus said, "Jesus, from now on, I'm going to give away half of everything I make. And if I've cheated anybody of anything, I'm going to repay that person 4 times as much as I cheated them." And Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to his house." So for Zaccheaus, the percentage was 50, plus 4 times anything you've cheated somebody on. Then there's the story of the rich young man. The rich young man, that's all he's described as, comes up to Jesus and says, "Jesus, I want to know how to inherit eternal life." And Jesus said, "That's easy. You just follow all the commandments. Do what you're supposed to do. Be a good person. And the man says, I've been a good person. I've followed all the commandments. And Jesus said, oh, for you, there's one more thing. You have to sell everything you own and give it to the poor. And then come follow me. For the rich young man, the percentage was 100. So Jesus is both somebody who criticizes people that they think they've done enough by giving 10% and challenges people with up to 100. So where does that leave us as we are doing our discernment about how much we are called to give as people? And what I want to suggest to you is the idea that was mentioned in the stewardship letter of growing in our proportional giving. That each year we should look at how much we have, how much we make, and how much we give away, and figure out the percentage. And then over time, seek to increase that percentage. So if you're at 2% now, we try to stretch in the next year to be 2.5 or 3. And then the next year, maybe 3.5. And we keep moving up because what we want is we want to always be growing. We might not be able to be perfect right now. We might not be able to take the leap and do whatever crazy thing Jesus is calling us to do. We might not be able to do that, but Jesus is gracious and merciful as well and calls us to keep trying and to keep growing. And so we can grow in the amount that we give. And what we want is that 10 years from now, we hope that we have grown in our generosity. Now, of course, we hope that we have grown in our faith, and we hope that we have grown in our love and patience and kindness. We are always seeking to grow, but giving of the money is the one that you can figure out with a calculator. And so we will know in 10 years if we have grown in the amount of money that we give away. I am not following my outline at all. Which is probably good because I probably have too much material. Here's the thing that with 100%. Jesus doesn't think this way at all. Jesus isn't thinking in terms of percentage of apples. What Jesus is envisioning and calling us to, and what the early church knew, is that Jesus wants us to have it all in common. That's why we gather around a common table every Sunday and share a common loaf and drink from a common cup. The vision of what the church should be is a place where we share our resources so that those who don't have enough will have enough. And those that have too much can share it with the community. We want a common table that we share everything. That's the vision of the early church, and that's, I think, what the vision of the kingdom of God that Jesus was calling us to. And if we want to be an economically diverse church, as our vision statement says, our vision statement says we're going to be racially diverse and ethnically diverse and economically diverse, which is always the hardest one. If we want to be economically diverse, we have to realize what Gandhi was talking about when he said to a hungry person, bread is God. And if we want a diversity of people here, we need to have a common table so that people who come here seeking sustenance can find it in all of the different forms, including spiritual, ethical, moral, and sport, which many of us enjoy. But if you don't have enough to meet your basic needs, you want to come to church and you want to find food, and you want to find ways that you're going to have shelter. And that's the real challenge of the American church. Is can we be a church that's economically diverse because we are a place that truly shares what we have? Okay. Now giving, if we're giving whatever we're giving, let's say we decided we're going to give 6% of our income. And I've already said that you can include nonprofits in that, and you can include giving to, people that your cousin who's down on his luck. Where is the church in that equation? I believe that if we are members of the church, if we are members of the community, the church should be in the top 2 of our giving. Probably at the top, but somewhere near the very top of the benefactors of our giving. And the reason is because the church is a different kind of organization. When we give to the church, we are giving to a community of which we are a part. When we give to a nonprofit organization, we are giving to people that are really good at meeting a specific physical need, whether it's giving to the hungry or providing housing or whatever, schools, whatever we want to do. When we give to other nonprofits, and that's great. But when we give to the church, we're giving to a community that we are a part of. And we are giving to in a way, it's relational giving. And relate that when we give to a church, we are giving relationally to people that we know and who are hopefully all inspiring us and challenging us and motivating us to be even more generous in the way we live our lives outside the walls of the church. Here's how I think of it. There once was a city filled with people, and the city had a big problem. The problem was that everybody's houses kept catching on fire. They had a problem with house fires. And everybody in the city believed that it was because of arsonists, that there were arsonists loose in the city setting everybody's house on fire. And so they invested money in fire departments and victims funds, but also in the police. We're going to catch those bad guys and make sure that we stop these house fires. But then amongst a small group of people in the city, they realized we're catching our houses on fire because we're really bad at using fire. We don't know proper fire safety. We are leaving our stoves on, and we're smoking in bed, and we're leaving candles on all night, and we have terrible wiring in our houses. There are no arsonists. There are no bad guys. The houses are catching on fire because we are catching our own houses on fire. And so they formed a little group of people to teach one another and support one another in better fire safety. It's like, if we're going to address this problem of houses catching on fire in our world, we need to stop catching our own houses on fire. I think the church is that little group of people. The church, the world is on fire, and we are trying to come together and stop pointing fingers at all the bad guys who are making the world terrible, and look at the ways that we are contributing to the problem and start making it better. Now, that only works if the church is always open and welcoming of new people. It only works if we have an evangelical spirit. Otherwise, our houses aren't going to catch on fire, but it's not going to change anything out in the city. We have an evangelical spirit of wanting to make the world better by how we live every single day. So that's why giving the church is different. It's because it's not just about fixing the problem out there, it's about fixing the problem, which is exactly what Jesus says in our passage this morning when he says, look, it's got to happen on the inside. Yes, give generously, grow in your giving, increase your giving. Jesus is kind and gracious and generous, and we all have our own issues that we struggle with in terms of how much we can give. But start from the inside, and everything is going to work itself out. Seek to grow, seek to expand your generosity. In 10 years, you want to be a more generous person than you are today. And if we have that honesty about where we are now and an ambition about where we want to go, then we will only improve in how we are living our lives. Honest now, ambitious about where we're heading, in our love, in our kindness, in our generosity to others. And then I believe if we do that, if we honestly seek to grow in our generosity and our love, we can justify calling ourselves Christian. Amen.